Hi, it's Peter Katz, and we're going to spend about 10 minutes introducing AgreeNet. AgreeNet is a managed service, meaning it's a hosted service, that provides people a way to manage their commitments with other people. Those people can be inside your company, or they can be outside your company, like customers and suppliers. Now, if you think about what goes on inside a company, all day long, work is getting done primarily as the result of agreements. We like to say a business is the sum of its agreements. But all work gets done because of agreements we make with each other, whether we're peers or with our boss, or even with our customers and suppliers. Actually, even with ourselves. But everything we do is a result of an agreement. There are small agreements and there are big agreements. So some agreements we may not need a tool to help us manage. But a lot of agreements are larger and more complex, and they may take place over days or weeks and even months. And it'd be nice if we had something to help us structure and manage those agreements. And probably more to the point, there are agreements that are kept, and in most organizations there are many agreements or commitments that are not kept. And it's not just that the agreements aren't kept, because even when they are, a lot of times the expectations of the customer and the supplier are not the same. But there's little argument that the most effective companies in the world have a culture of keeping agreements. I remember reading the autobiography of Jack Welch, former CEO of General Electric, and he talked about how GE was set up to be a company that had a culture of keeping agreements, a culture of closure and accountability. And he attributed this as one of the most important things to the success of General Electric. There's a great book by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Arki Chinkudi, and he talks about building trust in an organization, how it's dependent on eliminating forgotten commitments, unclear agreements, and missed deadlines. But that's not always easy in what he calls a random organization. And by random organization, we just mean that there's all kinds of competing priorities for all of us every day that makes it hard for us to keep our commitments. None of us sets out to miss our commitments, break our agreements, but there are obstacles to doing that. And to make matters worse, we don't have any tools to help us. We use email, we use meetings where we make agreements, we use telephone calls and so forth, but there's no structured way to help to create, negotiate, manage, and communicate those agreements. The idea for AgreeNet came out of real-life experience at a company called iLogistics, which is about a $700 million supply chain company, outsourced contract manufacturing for companies like Dell and IBM and Hewlett-Packard and Johnson & Johnson and Compaq and Microsoft. And what we saw there, that although we had contracts with these big companies, the real work gets done in the trenches, day to day, by project teams and project leaders. And the operational agreements that are made happen over the phone or happened over email or in a meeting room somewhere. And it became very hard to track, especially when something broke down later on, to find out where the problems lie, what was promised to whom, and more importantly, how to communicate accurately so that trust could be built between the two organizations. Let me give you an example of what we mean by the agreement negotiation. It's going to be a fairly trivial example. It may be so simple that we wouldn't use AgreeNet to do this, but it will explain a little bit about the idea behind the agreement workflow and how we can help tighten up the process. So, in the past I've run sales organizations. It wouldn't be unusual for my boss to come to me and say, "Peter, can you have a sales forecast to me by this Friday at noon?" Well, at that point he's identified the who, what, and the when of what he wants. The who being me, the what being the forecast, and the when being this Friday. So he's made a request. Now I might say, "Boss, now that I think about it, I'm going to be traveling the next couple of days. I don't have a lot of time, very busy schedule. Would you mind if I get that forecast to you by Monday morning?" Well, now what's happened is I've said the when is what I'd like to change, but I'm going to leave the who and the what as specified. I've made a counter proposal to my boss. Now my boss might come to me and say, "You know what, Peter, Monday's going to be fine. I'm not going to do anything with it over the weekend anyway." And so he has now accepted my counter proposal, the who, what, and the when. So let's go over quickly what just happened, because it's important and we can talk about some nomenclature here. A customer has made a request of a supplier. In this case, the customer was my boss and I was the supplier. So you notice that customer and supplier don't have to be true customer and supplier in the sense of a supply chain and outside suppliers and so forth. In every agreement, there's one customer and one supplier. If you ask something of your peer, then you're the customer and they're the supplier. Then the supplier made a counteroffer. Finally, the counteroffer was accepted by the customer. Only then do we actually have an agreement, and this is an important distinction also. You'll notice at all times in organizations, people will make requests of other people. Send an email, I need this by a certain date. That doesn't mean you have an agreement, and it leads to a lot of misunderstandings. And what we're trying to do here is clear up the communication, make everything understandable, build trust. And here we have an agreement when the agreement has actually been negotiated. All the terms have been accepted by both parties. But what happens to me when my boss comes back and says, you know what, Peter, I'm thinking about it. Last month you missed your forecast by almost 30%. I'd like you to get that forecast done by product line. So what he's done is he's changed the agreement request. And it may be that I can answer him right away and I don't have to change anything about my response, or more likely I'm going to have to go back to my product managers and say, I'd like to see that forecast now by product line. Essentially, I'm creating dependent agreements. I'm making requests of my product managers to get me information, so in turn I can provide the information to my boss. This is almost like a little supply chain, and you can imagine that things get much more complex this way. And when something down in the supply chain breaks or somebody's going to miss a date, it happens, and it's nice if we can communicate that very easily and people know about it, and we know all the affected agreements up the line that are going to be impacted by this break in the supply chain. It turns out that agreements can be very complicated. They're multi-threaded, they're linked together in the manners we talked about it. They're tied to events, they're tied to other documents and specifications and notes and all kinds of things, and it would be just absolutely wonderful if we had a place to manage all that. There's a great book by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Arki Chinkuti, and he talks about building trust in an organization, how it's dependent on eliminating forgotten commitments, unclear agreements, and missed deadlines. But that's not always easy in what he calls a random organization. And by random organization, we just mean that there's all kinds of competing priorities for all of us every day that makes it hard for us to keep our commitments. None of us sets out to miss our commitments, break our agreements, but there are obstacles to doing that. And to make matters worse, we don't have any tools to help us. We use email, we use meetings where we make agreements, we use telephone calls and so forth, but there's no structured way to help to create, negotiate, manage, and communicate those agreements. Well, that's precisely what AgreeNet is. It's a managed service available through the web to negotiate, manage, measure agreements. And in fact, it's a personal productivity tool also, because on top of all the wonderful things it does for your company, it also helps you manage what is owed to you by your suppliers and what you owe your customers. Here are just some of the things that AgreeNet does to help build trust inside an organization. In fact, we like to say AgreeNet builds trust and accomplishment. That's the end of the overview for today. Please go to our website and also to our site on YouTube to find all kinds of tutorials and other great information about AgreeNet. Thank you.